There are no experts. You probably know as much about possession as most priests. Look, your daughter doesn't say she's a demon. She says she's the devil himself. Now, if you've seen as many psychotics as I have, you'd realize that's the same thing as saying you're Napoleon Bonaparte. You asked me what I think is best for your daughter. 6 months under observation in the best hospital you can find.
About a month ago, I sat my wife down and showed her The Exorcist for the first time. After watching it, we discussed it in relation to the horror films of today. She pointed out how The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby seemed to stand apart from pretty much all modern horror. Both films felt like they were dramas that gradually turned into horror films by the end. Each film depicted deep and realistic human emotions. Both also had first acts filled with world building and character development, rather than trying to scare us right off the bat and leaving the characters shallow. Not that there's anything wrong with getting right into the scares. There's plenty of great horror films, both old and new, that do this effectively. But most of the time, they don't do such a great job, and then from then on, they end up feeling soulless and cheap. I think John Carpenter's Halloween from 1978 had a lot to do with this. It caused a ripple effect that we often see in Hollywood. You know, the one where a huge film comes along, it makes a ton of money, it's beloved by a massive fan base, and then tons of producers and studio heads take notice and decide, hey, if we can do the exact same thing that this movie did, without any effort anywhere else, we'll see the same success. And as per usual, this results in a huge wave of copycat films to follow that just simply aren't good. Now, this isn't where I take issue with Hollywood and horror. There are some filmmakers throughout the years that have followed this formula and innovated along the way, resulting in some great horror. Where I take issue is the forgetting of everything that came before Halloween. This takes me back to Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. These were films that were birthed from the Hollywood Renaissance, a time where filmmakers were breaking away from the goody-two-shoes type of storytelling that reigned supreme in the golden age of Hollywood. This new direction was able to bring us more dark and explicit material to thrill audiences in a way that had never been done before. And while Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist have their share of dark tones and explicit violence, it's their backbone of deep characters and captivating drama that elevated them to the classics that they are. This blend of drama and horror is something that we don't really see that much after Halloween. That is, until Ari Aster came along. Aster has written and directed 6 short films and 2 full-length films. And although there are interesting aspects to all of his work, today we're going to focus on 2 of his shorts, The Strange Thing About the Johnsons and Munchausen, and his 2 full-length films, Hereditary and Midsommar. All 4 of these films effectively blend a specific type of drama with different types of horror. The specific type of drama that we're talking about here is grief. Now, grief is an extremely heavy emotion. It's one that might even scare most writers away from exploring it, but not Aster. He seems to revel in it. Each of these films heighten their tension, deepen their characters, and amp up their horror, all at the hands of grief. Now, first we'll take a look at The Strange Thing About the Johnsons, a story about a dark and twisted secret that rips a family apart. Isaiah has been sexually abusing his father, Sidney, for about 14 years now. On Isaiah's wedding day, his mother, Joan, accidentally stumbles upon Isaiah and Sidney in the act without them realizing it. The following 20 minutes depict this broken family plagued by the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and eventually acceptance. Each member of the Johnson family deals with some pervasive form of emotional assault in the vein of grief. It is the very driving force behind the pain that each family member is feeling. This harrowing depiction of grief will set the stage for what's to follow in his next short film, Munchausen. Now, here we get a Pixar-esque dialogue-free short film that's all set to music. Think of the opening scene of Up. But things soon go terribly wrong. A mother is facing some anxiety surrounding her son leaving for college. She envisions him going to school, excelling at pretty much everything that he does, meeting a young girl, and then falling in love. It's the typical American dream type story that you might see in a Pixar film. Even the aesthetics here are borderline cartoonish. Yet, I feel like that's all very intentional here. Eventually, the son graduates college and decides that he wants to marry this girl. The mom is very happy for her son, but she's also very sad. By this point, you're probably putting 2 and 2 together, if the title of the film hasn't already done that for you, and you're realizing that this is not going to end well. After a short while, this is shown to all be in the mother's head, and we find ourselves right where we started at the beginning of the film. The son is packing his things, and so the mother decides to make him a sandwich, but adds some medicine slipped into it to make him sick. Eventually, the sickness takes over him, the son dies, and the mother is left haunted by the knowledge of what she did. Now, similar to The Strange Thing About the Johnsons, we have a mother dealing with some intense grief, but rather it being a dark secret that she has stumbled upon, it's this mother's own actions that are causing her grief. Let's take a look at the scene where she brings the sandwich to her son. She's about to hand him the sandwich, and then she hesitates. She turns around. For a brief moment, she realizes what she's doing. She's catching on to the madness that's overtaking her, and it's causing her to do something that she may regret. And then, it's too late. She stares at her son in horror as he blindly sets his own demise into motion. Now here, Aster has taken us to the notion of grief caused by our own action. The idea that we as humans sometimes directly cause horrifying things to happen to us and our loved ones closest to us. Now we're going to find ourselves where Hereditary is. Now Hereditary was my first exposure to Ari Aster's work, and it's still to this day, after having seen all of his work up to this point, my favorite thing that he's ever done. The major inciting incident of Hereditary is centered around the concept of horror caused by our own actions. A family member in an odd place after the loss of their estranged grandmother is pushed off of a cliff when their son Peter causes an accident resulting in the accidental death of his little sister Charlie. In A24's screenplay book for Hereditary, there's a foreword by director Bong Joon-ho. In this foreword, he suggests that this event is what kickstarts the actual horror within the film. Now, Bong says it more elegantly than I ever could, so I'm going to quote him directly. He says, "The film is substantially about the hell that a family suffers as generation after generation is swallowed by a demon." But it's actually saying that family itself, or ties defined by blood, is hell. I think this is an underlying theme in all of Aster's work. He drags his characters to the depths of the despair constantly. This action roots his characters in grief, which makes for an interesting experience as an audience member. Take a look at the characters that we've all discussed so far. Each experience that you have had as the viewer has been harrowing. You've connected with each character on a deep emotional level. You've literally grieved with these characters. This in turn allows Aster to have these characters make some dark and questionable decisions that we might not judge as harshly as audience members. This is why his films give you such conflicting feelings in your gut after you watch them. The longer that you sit on these feelings after watching, the more you start to realize about these characters and their decisions. Your viewpoint starts to skew a little bit after leaving them. And this is why I love Aster's work so much. It allows for incredible discussion afterwards. Take a look at how Peter reacts to his sister's death. After an entire minute of being frozen in his car seat in complete shock, he finally musters up the courage to drive onward. He drives home, he staggers through the hallways of his house, onward to his bedroom, and then he just lies awake in bed all night. Then the morning brings, well, why don't you just watch for yourself? Now you see, Aster has fully weaponized grief. We have experienced this scene from Peter's perspective. We experienced the same shock as him. Never mind the fact that we've just watched a 14-year-old girl get beheaded. That's not what we're focused on. We are instead locked in on the horror that Peter is experiencing. He was desperately trying to rush his sister to the hospital one minute, and then the next, she's dead. This level of despair and grief unlocks a chamber within us. This is something that we can all collectively tap into. This is something that we would all deeply be terrified of. Regardless of how flawed and complex the characters may be, we can understand the grief and pain that is driving them. One of the things that grief drives a wedge between in this film is Peter and his mother, Annie. Now, she and Peter's relationship has been a bit strained over the years, just to say the least.
I never wanted to be your mother.
Yeah, fine, release me. Just say it. Just fucking say it. Don't you swear at me, you little shit! Don't you ever raise your voice at me! I am your mother!
Yeah, as you can see, things are a little rough. And to make things worse, Charlie didn't even want to go to this party that resulted in her demise. Annie made her go with Peter. So now we have an intense mix of unspoken feelings between these two characters. Peter feels guilty for not only what he did to his sister, but for the extreme pain that he's causing his mother. And Annie feels responsible for making Charlie go to the party, but she also feels anger towards Peter for what he has put her through. This guilt separates the family, and it leaves them vulnerable to this demon that ultimately rips them apart. It's a truly hard experience on both the first and second watch. The first time, you're bitter towards Annie. You don't trust her. You're almost afraid of her. Then on your second watch, you start to see the signs, and you start to understand her dark history and grief. You begin to feel sorry for her. The grief has complicated your feelings towards Aster's characters, which is the perfect segue to Midsommar, a film with probably the most grief-stricken opening in all of cinema. Yeah, so whereas the rest of Ari's work eases you into grief, as you can see here, Midsommar grabs you by the scalp and immediately smashes your face into it. The film literally opens with the protagonist, Danny, concerned with a cryptic chain of emails that she's received from her bipolar sister, only to find out that her sister has committed suicide and taken both her and Danny's parents with her. I can't express into words how this opening sequence hit me the first time that I watched it. It's something that you have to experience for yourself. It still turns my stomach into a knot in the exact same way that I felt the first time, every time that I watch it. But we've been talking enough about Aster's depiction of grief. Now we're on our way to how grief conflicts you. This is my favorite part about Midsommar. The grief is kind of surgically stitched to the character of Danny. So much so that it creates an overwhelming sense of conflict in relation to its ending. Danny has been recently orphaned, her boyfriend is a dick, and she's stuck in a Swedish commune with a cult that's feeding on her friends. Well, at least her boyfriend's friends. Throughout the entirety of the film, it's constantly made abundantly clear that she isn't done grieving. In fact, she physically and emotionally cannot overcome her grief because no one will grieve with her. She literally has no family to comfort her, and her boyfriend won't comfort her. So in the end, she's forced to take whatever comfort that she can. Her only option ends up being this cult who's been kidnapping, torturing, and murdering people on behalf of tradition and prosperity for decades, possibly centuries now. Now on paper, this sounds ludicrous. One might even scoff at the thought of finding this remotely feasible. However, if you've seen the film, not only do you understand what I'm talking about, but you've felt this very conflict. I almost felt like I needed to take a shower after my first time watching this film because of this. And it wasn't because of the deeply disturbing imagery that is littered all throughout the many cult's rituals in the film. As the film's credits started to roll, I was deeply disturbed that Danny had joined this murderous cult. Yet, on the other hand, I was happy for her. She finally found a new family, a group of people who held her, who comforted her, who mourned with her. The final frame of the film is her smiling, like truly actually smiling for the first time in the entire film. That was the moment when I realized that Ari Aster is truly a master of grief. This is a man who understands the power and gravity of this heavy emotion. He has wielded it throughout his entire filmography in many different ways, and no matter how he uses it, whether it's to shock us, have us sympathize with others, to horrify us, to conflict us, or perhaps even utilize it further on in works of his down the road that we might not even imagine. It's his deep understanding of grief that allows him to craft the kind of horror that we've been sorely lacking over the past few decades. Now, Aster is not the only masterful writer and director who is innovating in this genre. Jordan Peele, Robert Eggers, and Mike Flanagan are just a few names that come to my mind whose contributions are just as important and just as incredible. But out of all of the names in horror today, it's Aster's who has my deepest attention, and I eagerly await his future contributions to the medium.
Help, Eamon!